All right, fantastic. Well, welcome everybody to our webinar, 3 things that sales leaders must have to start and close more deals. I am Bernie Borges from Vengreso. I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before I introduce our speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping that maybe I've already covered to some extent, and that is that little chat function that some of you have already been experimenting with is the best way to pose a question or a comment. Again, I will be moderating, so I will pick up on some of them, and we'll try to make this interactive. We're planning to go for 45 minutes, and so we will send the webinar recording within 24 to 48 hours. For those of you who attended and those of you who did not attend and are listening or watching this in the future, make sure that you're looking for that in your inbox. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me introduce our speakers. First, we have my co-founder and partner at Vengreso, Viveka von Rosen. We have, went too fast. We have Dan Coady, Regional Vice President of Enterprise Sales at MindTickle, and Jake Brawley, VP of Strategic Alliances and Partner Sales at Highspot. And as I said, we have, boy, my clicking is just going too fast. We have an ambitious topic today, and that is to really discuss what are the 3 things that sales leaders must have to start and close more deals. So we want to actually begin with a question, a key question on that topic. And that question is, drum roll please. All right, that question is, thank you. What does the C-suite expect from today's leader? In other words, if we're going to talk about the 3 things that sales leaders need to do, we need to discuss it in the context of what the expectations are from the C-suite. So who'd like to start this one off? What does the C-suite expect from today's sales leader?
Yeah, I think I can take that, Bernie. So what I've seen in my career, right, all along and increasingly more and more in the last several years is a C-suite focus on linear rep productivity, right? And this has become a key, generally board-driven metric, right? But the problem is twofold, right? Until recently, there has not been a programmatic way to improve rep capability. This has often fallen on the hands of sales leaders to solve for, right, with mixed results. Yeah. The other piece is traditional sales or onboarding has been episodic versus continuous. And this is counterintuitive to the forgetting curve that shows that people forget 90% of what they learn in 30 days. So this leaves a C-suite with a dilemma, right? It leaves them with unuseful subjective data on rep capability that can be difficult to action on. And my point of view and MindTickle's point of view is that this needs to change, right? In order to provide leadership with actionable intelligence to improve rep performance across all of their selling disciplines. Because even a small amount of linear productivity can deliver significant revenue improvement to an organization.
Okay.
And to pile on to that, if we look at how our sales leaders are brought up through the organization, they're usually in sales. They usually don't have a lot of management skills. They're brought up, they're promoted, and now all of a sudden, they're expected, to Dan's point, to be coaches, managers, and a lot of them, if you got a lone wolf salesperson who's now a lone wolf sales leader, that's hard to replicate. It's almost impossible to replicate. So yeah, the expectation of the C-suite on their sales leaders to have producing sales people when the sales leader might not even have the tools that he or she needs is an expectation that's hard to meet, needless to say.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is, let me add in here, this is Jake Brawley, and sorry guys, I've got webcam envy today if I'm having some technical difficulties, but hopefully my voice will be engaging enough. Here's the thing we see is the whole sales leader, that role is rapidly transforming. It used to be sales leader needs to absolutely nail the forecast, needs to hit the quarterly numbers. That's the primary focus, right, Viv? I see you laughing. The world has changed, and I think in part because, buyers today don't want to be sold to. And so that means sales has had to transform from a selling motion really to facilitating the buying process. And so I see sales accountability really broadening now to revenue accountability and customer experience from start to continuous And I think that's, the expectation from today's sales leader goes well beyond the quota and the quarterly numbers. Certainly that's still there, but there's a lot more expectation of these leaders today.
So Jake, you hit on a key point, and that is, I think, summarized in something we've prepared for the webinar, and that is that the role of the buyer and the way the buyer behaves is different.
Yeah.
The modern buyer has moved the cheese, right? So in preparing for this webinar today, what we all agreed to in the context of delivering this concept around the 3 things sales leaders must have, we said, well, let's really frame it up as a 3-part modern framework. And so we've outlined the 3 parts right now, right here in this slide. And so what I want us to do now is unpack these 3 parts, right? Mindset and culture being one of them, modern tools, and cadence. So let's unpack each one of these one by one. We'll begin with mindset and culture. And Dan, why don't you lead us off on why is mindset and culture so important?
Yeah, I think it starts with leadership, right? And I think that the idea of a learning culture, right, is not new, or continuous improvement is not new. I think it's critical for leaders to lead by example. We need to take personal ownership of self-improvement and performance improvement in order to gain buy-in from the organization. I think only then, when you have inspired in such a way, can you set expectations and ultimately realize the outcomes that can be had from up leveling everyone's skill set.
Okay.
Yeah.
There used to be a time where we talked about rep efficiency. Now we're talking about effectiveness. Why is that?
Yeah, I think that. Oh, sorry. That's not for.
Yeah. No. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I just from our standpoint, effectiveness, efficiency might mean, how well are they running a sales cycle? How well are they capturing that data in a CRM like Salesforce? But effectiveness really means, how do we up level our reps' capability? The biggest nightmare for a sales leader is knowing that they're in a cycle and they're up against their competitors' A players, and we have B and C players that we know need a lot of improvement. That's our biggest nightmare. And it's how do we drive that change? How do we do it in a way that doesn't take away time from us in front of our customers? And how do we do it in an operational and programmatic way?
And the pushback we get, because we train people how to use social selling, is sellers want to sell. They don't want to be saddled down with all of these tools and all of this training and all of this, these new strategies that they have to put into place. And do they have to give up, what's been working for them? But the fact is, to your point, Dan, it's got to start with the leadership. If we don't get leadership buy-in, and if we don't have the leadership either, encouraging with a carrot or whacking with a stick, the sellers are not going to be engaged. And then we have to prove the tool. We have to prove that the CRM system is worth using. LinkedIn Sales Navigator is worth using. Whatever analytics tool that you've got is worth using. You've got to prove that in order to shift that mindset and that culture to go just from like, I'm going to sell to your point, Dan, I'm going to improve myself. I'm going to become more effective. And that might mean investing some time. It might mean investing some money, but it's totally worth it. But that all starts with the leadership. And if the leadership isn't bought in, you're not going to have a successful launch.
Jake, chime in here. I know you've got thoughts on this.
Yeah, culture shift is always challenging in sales. You guys know that, who have been through change management. If you're shifting from a methodology, if you're trying to move from, an enterprise selling motion to transactional, those are tough shifts. So a cultural shift, especially with today's sales leadership, we tend to have more experience. That's a tough proposition. And I think, the way to do it, we'll talk about that a little bit, but we have to move away from the mentality of, like you said, efficiency, which is about how do we get more minutes and more hours spent with our customers. The reality is we're spending less and less time with customers today. They do not give you as much time. You literally have minutes, whereas we had hours before. And you have to make every single engagement count, whether it's a direct message on social, whether it's an email, all of those matter. And that's why effectiveness is the new focus. And so it's less about getting more time. There's only so much time that you have. You can only extract so much juice from that, right? You only have 24 hours in the day. So we have to look at how can I then increase the effectiveness and impact of every single interaction. And that cultural shift does require a different way of doing things. It's not about getting the right forecast, doing the right activities. It's about responsiveness. It's about the quality of my interactions. And so coaching and the focus around that starts to become much more important.
Yeah, Jake, you remind me of a stat from Gartner that says that the average B2B buyer only spends 16% of their journey talking with the suppliers that they're considering buying from. So to your point about we spend less time. So it's crazy.
Yeah,
so
I think that 84%, by the way, Bernie, if you're the seller of that vendor where they're spending, you better believe that you have to know where they're spending that other 84% too, and you have to kind of be expert on that. So the expectations of a salesperson go way up.
Yeah.
Exactly. Dan, I think you're prepared to give us some insights into what we're looking at here on the screen here.
Yeah, this comes from Aragon. Aragon and others, like Forrester and Gardner have defined this area, this space. It's really a relatively new category. There's some working definitions on it, right? Some people refer to as readiness, some as enablement. But what they're doing here is drawing a line between what traditional LMS platforms approach are, and to this new approach, which is what I refer to as that continuous enablement, right? So what's interesting is the analysts have defined this as a category. The market is reflecting a commitment to this category in terms of investment dollars in this space, in terms of the number of people that are have enablement or other titles, others in their title on LinkedIn. You see, so what the really boils down to is three things. One, it's great to be called as a category leader, right? But what they're saying are really three key things in my view. And one is that readiness it's a rapidly emerging business critical category for the enterprise. It delivers material impact to the business. And those without a programmatic approach to readiness are going to be at a competitive disadvantage because their competitors are just going to have better enabled reps competing against you.
When I think of the word ready, I think of speed. Like if to be ready means you're ready to go now. So in the context of what we're describing here, what we're describing and discussing here is for sales team to be ready to engage when the buyer's ready to engage. So great discussion on the first pillar, mindset and culture, which I think maybe for some is a little bit of a surprise, right? Thinking about the idea of just mindset and culture being one of the pillars that sales leaders need to embrace to be successful. So let's move to the second one, and that's tools, but not just tools, modern tools. So let's unpack this one. And Jake, let's start with you. What is it about modern tools that we want to discuss today?
Yeah, so one of the things just on the previous slide there, I see sales engagement. There's a lot of different terms we see from analysts, and they're constantly evolving. Enablement, at least for me, isn't a new term. And for a lot of you out there, you've been doing sales enablement for the last 15, 20 years. The thing that's changed dramatically is what that means in terms of the technology that allows us to do enablement, really for the first time in a way that's modern and impactful and makes sense for a seller's day-to-day workflow. The systems and tools that they're in, and making sure that they have the knowledge, they know what they need to understand about the products and services, the value prop. They know what they need to say in terms of the discovery, questions to ask, questions to be ready to answer, and then they know what to show. They actually have the content there. And all of that has to be seamless, streamlined, and at all of those single moments of engagement, wherever the seller is. If you're on mobile, if you're in your inbox, if you're in the CRM opportunity record. And so it's exciting because we do have, I think modern is the key word here, we have technology that can really address this for the first time. And so enablement is going through this major renaissance, and I think large in part due to the tools and the technology and how we've advanced. And so we've moved from this era, and I don't know, Bernie, we'll show I think we've got a Google Trends slide in here. Yeah, there we go. it's really interesting. I think this drives it home. If you look at this is last 15 years, as I was saying, enablement's not a new thing. We were doing it in certain pockets of certain industries. Now it's gone mainstream. And so with technology, we've moved out of this era of efficiency, automation, Salesforce automation, marketing automation, into an era of effectiveness. It's exciting because these technologies are focused on, like I said before, what is the impact and effectiveness of every single engagement that you're having? And we get much more returns if we can impact the top line versus the bottom line. So this new era of enablement is really about top line growth. It's about driving sales productivity and effectiveness. And the stat there that you see, and this one just blew me away when I saw it, but marketing often funds a lot of these technologies, ironically, because they're the ones that are doing enablement in the absence of having a dedicated enablement team. They're often where budgets are initially coming from to support enablement technologies because they are publishing and producing a lot of the content that sales consumes. And you see the stat there that marketing is now spending more of their annual budgets on sales enablement technology than on marketing automation. And this is exciting news for all of us, not just in sales, but anybody who's a revenue leader. And we're getting more aligned to a buyer, which is great because a buyer doesn't want to be on a journey. They want to buy something and they want you to facilitate that. And so this is, for me, an exciting time to be in and around this discussion in this industry.
You said something I want to come back to because you covered a lot and you glossed over this very casually. I want to come back to it. I think it's a key point. And that is this here. 11% of the marketing budget is spent on sales enablement. Marketing budget on sales enablement.
That's right.
Let that sink in. What's the meaning of that?
Well, let me add, that's a great question. Let me add one other piece. I mentioned the renaissance, the almost redefining of sales enablement. Sales used to be about how do we enable the sales department? How do we enable sellers? Sales enablement today, it's quickly become how do we enable the organization to drive more sales? And in fact, it's becoming so much so that Serious Decisions is actually starting to call this category revenue enablement. Mm-hmm. And it's really because of what I said before. Customer experience happens with every single touch point with your company. And on average, another Serious Decision stat, there's 9 people within the buying and decision life cycle mm-hmm. that a buyer is touching with any organization. That can either be a very disjointed customer experience or it can be a very fluid and seamless experience. But it can only be fluid and seamless when all of those customer-facing roles are on the same page. And so enablement has also quickly gone from just about sales to anybody who has a customer-facing role. They need to have the same level of effectiveness in all of their engagements.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to call attention to the red line here in Salesforce automation. And there's a question in chat about products like Salesforce and the role of Salesforce. is that still considered a tool? And actually, I want to invite Viv's comment on that because I know, in your day-to-day, you're exposed to that. And Dan, of course, want to hear from you as well. So Viv, what's your take on the role of a tool like Salesforce in the context of modern tools?
Yeah. So as I was saying to Adriana, it's definitely more modern than the Rolodex. So in that way, it's a tech-driven SaaS type tool. It's modern. However, one of the things to me that makes modern sales tools modern is the fact that they're actually easy to use. And our friend John over at Nimble, the reason they call Salesforce is because you have to force salespeople to use it. It's not the most intuitive tool in the world. I think we can all agree. The other interesting thing, though, is that, they're always adapting. Salesforce is always adapting its usability and its integrations. And you look at more tools that started out as marketing tools, like, say, a HubSpot. And, it's almost like the marketing tools are forcing our modern sales tools to be more integrated and to be more intuitive and to be better at not only taking information in, but enabling our modern salespeople, not just to track sales and where are we in the funnel, but how can we further along that we further along that particular deal, and how can we support it, and how, like I said, how can we enable it? So that's a long answer.
Yeah, and Adriana is making a key point about the importance of integration. And
Yeah.
Dan, I'd love for you to comment on not just integration, but the role of readiness, which is your world, right? Like, what's the role of tools and readiness?
Yeah, I think, having come from the world of Salesforce, I spent a 5-year tour there in my career. So I have a huge respect for the technology. It's a very robust and incredibly dynamic technology. But what they've done is that Salesforce, as robust and as modern as it is, there are still many tools out there that they had to purchase and add to their stack, because there was a better tool in the marketplace that was filling a better need or a better niche, right? If you think about marketing automation, they purchased ExactTarget and Pardot, made a first attempt at Wave for analytics years ago, and ended up buying Tableau instead. At CPQ, they purchased Steelbrick. So whenever I look at this as another instance of another major gap in the marketplace, where this just isn't being addressed, as you see from this data here, right? Forrester pointing out this small amount of investment on something that delivers material revenue impact. It's underserved, and hence this category is emerged. And it's being recognized. So it's not so much to say that the one isn't modern, the other isn't. It's just that's just sometimes the way the market advances, and this is the way of the market reacting. And with the integrations that all of our tools have with platforms like Salesforce are extremely robust. Sort of work in conjunction, right? And with the goal of our goal is improving reps performance, so that there's linear improvement productivity across the organization, where Salesforce, depending on its use case, has slightly different purpose.
Yeah, and we should point out, for everyone's benefit here, that the term is Salesforce automation, so we're not here to pick on Salesforce, the company, by any means.
Right. Okay, the question was specific to Salesforce.
Yeah, no, I get it, but I want to make sure that we're also making the distinction between what's on the red line, which is the category of Salesforce automation, and not the company. I want to cover one more topic related to tools, because we've been talking about so far 2 of the 3 pillars, if you will, and what I want to talk about here is sort of the plethora, the abundance of the sales tools tech stack. Right? The fact that there are so many. And this whole webinar is about the 3 things sales leaders need to be successful. And one of them is tools, but there's so many of them out there. So how do sales leaders navigate the landscape and manage it? What's their role in the selection? How closely do they work with marketing? Do they delegate it to marketing? Any and all the above. Jake, I'll start with you.
Well, the answer is they absolutely have to be part of the evaluation. You're not going to get a piece of software into sales, and you're not going to get it adopted unless there's 100% buy-in. I think it also means, and I've never heard I didn't know the namesake was for sales. First time I heard that, Biz, but I think it's telling, because I do think we've now gone from an era of enterprise software, and certainly a lot of those solutions came out of that era, to now the expectation is that there's a consumer experience, especially with the millennial and even Gen Z sellers that are coming in. They are expecting the Amazon experience. They're expecting the Google experience.
Exactly.
That's what they're expecting in sales technology that's being introduced today. And so you absolutely have to evaluate the software in terms of its consumer and usability experience for your end users. We've also gone from an era where you're thinking about use cases to the users themselves, and what is that experience? And Adriana mentions integration is key. I absolutely agree with that. And we see this very much so. We have this concern. There's sales tool fatigue. I can't bring another system in because this is yet another system for my salespeople to go to. Well, they shouldn't have to. You need to look at where are they going today? And the answer is typically they're in their inbox, they're in CRM, and they're in maybe a handful of other solutions. If you don't have access and integration at all of the points where a seller is already working, you're not asking them to do something new, and you're not taking them out of your workflow, then you might want to question whether or not it makes sense to bring in that tool.
Exactly.
So short answer is look at it from a user adoption, especially if you're looking at something that sales people are going to be using their day to day.
And one thing to that point, Jake, that I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm like, Jake, Dan. One thing to that point is that, yes, we're picking on Salesforce, but whatever CRM integration that you're using, if you have the option to choose where you got the lead from, like a lot of salespeople aren't just even using that drop down, but also to your point, what sales technology helped you get to this point in the sale? And a lot of times, it's not even provided to the salesperson, or if it is, they're not checking on it. But when a company forces you then to choose, okay, did I use Sales Navigator? Did I use, what this technology, that technology? What they find is, most salespeople are using about 10 to 15% of the tools that are provided to them. And it's an incredible waste of money. Now, here's a real opportunity for us to refocus that chunk of change into either tech stacks that integrate better, to your point, or to training, or to whatever. But yeah, the lack of adoption of the sales tech stack is
so to my esteemed
amazing.
panelists, here's where I want to go next.
Okay.
I'm gonna come back to what you just said, Viv, because as I'm listening to this conversation, you really took me to exactly where I want to go, and that is, this webinar is sponsored by Vengreso, Highspot, and MindTickle. And we're not here to do a pitch, but what I do want to do for context for our audience is, let's give our audience some context on how you can measure effectiveness in our respective worlds. So Viv, I'll start with you because you can just kind of pick up where you left off, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we at Vengreso, when we work with companies, how can their salespeople measure their effectiveness in the things that we're helping them do through digital selling?
Well, obviously, we're big fans of Sales Navigator, although we do teach just free LinkedIn too, but Sales Nav has better analytics to it. And so, that's easy. You just check out your SSI score. Is it going up or is it going down? So that's one thing that we can check on as to effectiveness. In addition, in your CRM system, are you choosing, how you got into conversation with the client? Was it LinkedIn? Was it Sales Navigator? Was it another tech tool? And which tech tools are you using to, again, repeat what I said earlier? But, it's the necessity of identifying what got you to this point in the sale, and what got you to this point in the training, and what got you to this point in whatever, is sometimes forgotten because it's not important necessarily to the salespeople. It is very important to the sales leaders. So we just need to find a way to remind our buyers, or our sellers rather, that this is important to their path as well. And with Vengreso, with training, it's emails, it's gamification, it's reporting. I mean, we've got a lot of different ways of keeping our learners on track and invested and competing with each other.
Sure.
And,
Sure.
Going for the win. You can't just say, here's a great tool, enjoy, because they won't.
Right. Okay. All right, Dan, in the MindTickle world, how do sales leaders measure effectiveness?
Well, we're obsessed with performance analytics here at MindTickle, right? One of the things we're driving towards is correlating rep performance and rep capability to revenue, right? That's the golden nugget we're driving towards. What we've launched, recently is our sales capability index, right? Where we're capturing all relevant data around, touch points with the customer, around, the certification scores, around, our Call AI product that captures, key metrics on customer interactions, and begin to capture, a consistent score on how good or how capable, the sales reps are. Why this is so important to senior leadership is back to the point we touched on earlier, is that this is a board-driven metric, right? In terms of driving rep productivity. And it's impossible to do if you can't measure, right? It's impossible to do if you just have these terrible subjective discussions on this guy's good, that guy's no good, based on what, his ATV performance to date. You need better, data around this so that the business can pivot and make critical improvements, or make, staff changes that's based on real actionable data.
Okay. Jake, in the Highspot world, how do you measure effectiveness?
Oh yeah, this is my favorite topic because this has always been a black box.
We only have 15 minutes left, by the way.
You can have
I'm
9
kidding.
minutes.
I'm kidding.
I could go all day. I saw the question from Maria. I got excited. But modern, a big part of modern is we have more data, we have analytics, and we have machine learning to even help do stuff with those analytics that we as humans might not even see in the data. So, modern for Highspot, we think about the analytics really needing to be along all of those touch points I talked about. So let me just give you a quick illustration. If I have a strategy that says, look, I want to increase my competitive win rate by 5 points this year. It is super important. That is the strategy. That is my goal. I've got a set of things that I need to be able to do with all of my frontline people to make that happen, from educating them to maybe presenting in a new way, presenting a new materials, using new materials to follow up. And if I'm doing that, doing it well, and the strategy was set up with the right content to support it, then I should see the positive impacts. And so we look at analytics, what we call strategy into action. How can I look from the leading indicators of, okay, we went out and trained everybody. Did they even listen? If they listened, did they retain? If they retained, are they running the new plays? Are they doing the things we're expecting to do? If they're doing those things, is it having the right impact and leading indicator impact? Meaning, are people opening it? Are they looking at it? Are they more engaged? Are we increasing sales stage velocity and conversion? And then ultimately, if you have been able to answer all of that, it's not just about increased quota attainment. It's about what you're trying to do. In this case, I want to look at my competitive win rate. And if I've been able to move the needle on that, and that was my intent, now I've got analytics all along the way to optimize, to course correct, and to know if I'm successful in doing that. So that's the exciting thing for all of us anywhere in this kind of revenue leadership equation.
Okay, fantastic. All right, we have about 12 or 13 minutes left. And so far we've covered 2 of the 3 pillars. We've covered mindset/culture. We've covered modern tools. I think we can do an entire webinar just on that alone. And the third one is cadence. And so in the remaining time before we do a wrap up, let's talk about the role of cadence. And the way we've framed it up here is a continuous cadence versus episodic. So Viv, why don't you start us off on this topic?
Well, and I think we've covered this a little bit already, but the idea of getting a sales training and forgetting most of it and not implementing anything, that the episodic training, the episodic implementation of the tools that we have, the episodic way that we engage with our buyers, obviously is not as effective as having a continuous cadence. And, again, in our training program, that's what it all leads up to. What is the cadence? What are you doing every day, continually? Eat the elephant one bite at a time. And I know there's other ways of looking at this, which Dan and Jake will talk to in just a minute. But I think it's just important to remember it's not stop, go. It is continuous engagement that's needed over, multi-threaded, over multi-platforms to multi-buyers. It's not black and white anymore. It's not one activity that's going to create results. It's continuous activity.
Okay. Dan, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that having a culture of of enablement and continuous improvement, it's all about how you execute that and what that cadence looks like, right? So, we spoke about how important it is for leadership to be completely bought in and leading by example here. It's also important to think about how do you incentivize reps. I think organizations out there are now, as part of an MBO, as part of their comp plans, include certain training milestones to be completed. And when you combine all that together and you create a culture that's so invested in weekly weekly cadence of training that's validated and discussed and coached, right, by their manager, you start to see dramatic improvement in performance across the board.
Okay. Jake.
Yeah, from my standpoint, these aren't mutually exclusive. I think we've heavily focused on episodic, which is why I think we're talking about and elevating continuous. But the reality is you have to do both. And the reason is, if I'm continually keeping my sales force up to speed on my new products, my new services, maybe the market landscape is changing. Absolutely. That is a continuous thing. That does not work to have an asynchronous kind of training in traditional format. But there's also a need to have episodic in addition to that. It might be the case that I've been getting continuous training on competitive, to use the example previously, but now I'm walking into a deal in my 2 o'clock meeting with a new buyer persona and a competitor that hasn't been part of that continuous reinforcement. It's an episode. I still need to, in the moment, have what I need to address that and to be knowledgeable about that. And so I think there's a balance between these two. There's certainly situational, we think of plays for competitor ABC, for objection X, Y, or Z. Those are episodic. We need those, but we also need to continually reinforce around those things. And so I think it's a little bit of both. And certainly, Dan, from your perspective, and Viv, some of the commentary you made, yeah, we need to do more on continuous. I think that's been the anemic side of this equation.
So one thing that I'll add briefly before we segue to a visual that we want to show and talk to is the concept of behavior. So when we think of continuous, we think of behavior, having a behavior that is continuous, so that it's not something that has to be thought about because it's part of a salesperson's behavior. And that kind of leads us to this visual here. So Viv, why don't you talk to what's going on these data charts here?
Yeah, on the left-hand side, what's interesting to me is if you've ever been on the receiving end of this, email, phone call, voicemail. And yes, you need a certain amount of contact. You need those optimal attempts. But there's a limit too, which is 7. So that's kind of interesting because go for the no and understand that after 7 times, you're actually going to have a pretty significant drop in your success rates, like from even just 1. So that was actually very interesting to me. And then the other thing is the fact that a lot of salespeople will, email and phone. But by increasing to just one more media type, maybe it's a LinkedIn message or a LinkedIn in-mail or a text or whatever, I just happen to like LinkedIn, it'll actually increase your success rate by 4x. So that's, it's pretty interesting. Use 3 different mediums and, know when to chillax on it a little bit too. Know when too much is too much.
Jake, what are your thoughts on this this data here that we're looking at?
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Some of those leading indicators that we were talking about, you need to understand, are those things happening? And then, of course, they're happening. This is where the coaching comes in. Are they happening at a quality level, or are they happening at an annoyance level that's not working? And so, I think the reason coaching, and you'll see similar research, by the way, if you look at Serious Decisions, did a good piece on the number of observations, coaching observations, and the effectiveness of that sales organization. And you really have to get up above 10 to 20. I mean, this really has to be a dedicated commitment. So along with kind of this engagement and the cadence around that, it's also the coaching to say, okay, we're doing it. Is it good? Or are we just doing it, checking the box, and we're not getting the results? So I think that's important to have that qualitative piece.
Dan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we all get hit up by folks trying to sell us stuff, particularly in this space, right? So yesterday was really interesting. It was great this topic is raised. I actually responded to someone out of professional courtesy, right? And it was, someone reaching out, but they did it in such a skillful way, with thought and follow through. Like, for instance, they understood my background. They actually understand some of the challenges and pain I face in a real way. Mm-hmm. When they said they're going to try my cell phone, I don't know how they got my cell phone. When they tried They tried, they said they're going to call me at a certain time. They did, left me a great commercial. It get to the point where out of professional courtesy, I had to call them back, and I haven't done that in years, right? So, but to Jake's point, the quality of reach out is what's what needs to be measured and tracked and trained on. Again, it's an ongoing thing, right? And this is, you know, kind of the theme of our conversation. So I would fall back on, you know, how do we improve the quality of those reach outs is the key focus here.
Yeah, we have something called PVC, which is personalize, add value, and then put in your call to action. You do it, you know, between 1 to 2 messages. And I think you're absolutely right, Dan. Like, yeah, 7 really spammy invitations to connect, followed by buy my stuff, followed by an email, buy my stuff. I don't care if it's 7 times. That's not going to be as effective as, like you said, maybe a message and a follow-up phone call and a voicemail that were quality. That's interesting that you did that, Dan. I was thinking of the opposite. I was thinking I made the mistake of looking at something on Facebook, and now I am getting hammered with like I wish I was exaggerating, 4 to 5 emails a day from this company, and I've blocked them, so I don't even know how they're still getting through. So, yeah.
Yeah. Trisha asks, how long between attempts after 7 attempts, you know, no response? How would the 3 of you respond to that question?
I would turn it over to Bernie, who's our CMO.
I do get a lot of salespeople calling on me, and I think it should be spread out over some reasonable period of time. Not every day, but not months either. So, you know, a few days, a few weeks in between. And Dan, to your point, likewise, when I see a good outreach, something that is unique and really speaks to me and something that is relevant to me, a pain point of mine, I respect that. I may respond. I may occasionally, you know, take the call, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think we're all on the receiving end. I'm gonna move on just because I'm watching the clock, and we committed to a 45-minute event here, and I'm really just going to begin the wrap up. You know, we've discussed here this ambitious topical agenda of what are the 3 things sales leaders need to be able to create and win more deals, and we framed it up under these three pillars of the modern framework: mindset, culture being one, modern tools, and cadence. So I'm just going to ask for closing thoughts from each of you, and Jake, I'll start with you.
No.
Oh, you know what? Jake has dropped off. I'm sure unintentional. He was on audio, so he's no longer with us. So we'll have Viv. We'll come to you next. Closing
Yeah,
thoughts.
I mean, obviously, we've actually got 6 phases, but pretty much these 3 incorporate all of them. Just to recap, as you said, you know, you've got to have the leadership mindset, not only your sales leaders, but really your C-suite as well, in order to encourage the sales force to implement the modern tools in a cadence that's effective. You know, these elements are so key to your sales team's success.
Dan, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, you know, in being a sales leader, right, to all the sales leaders out there, there's a ton of noise and distraction, right, when it comes to doing our jobs. There's so many tools out there. There's so much competition for our mind share that when it comes to a tool, it really needs to move the needle. It needs to solve world hunger for us, which is things like growing pipeline, or closing more deals, right? So in this space, right, in this sort of theme we're speaking about, when you think about readiness or enablement, having a learning mindset, having a culture set there, having the right technology in place, and an execution cadence is going to deliver impact to your organization. And for me, that's why this space is so important. And I see the results across our customers as well as our own internal organization.
Yeah, and since Jake unfortunately dropped off, I'll take his spot, and I'll leave a closing thought of my own, and that is that the modern sales leader really should have this conversation with their C-suite. And so if their C-suite is old school and is saying, hey, add more salespeople and have them make more phone calls, which is old school, the conversation really needs to be around the modern framework really begins with the things we discussed here today. We've got to have the right mindset and culture that's being driven throughout the organization. We have to have the right tools and implement them so that we can measure effectiveness and outcomes, and then have the cadence to execute them properly and with the behavior, the continuous behavior that we discussed, even though Jake gave a good example of some potential episodic behaviors or cadences. So on that note, let me just point out 3 resources that we are going to email to all of you. And I want to point out that these resources are ungated, so please be on the lookout for an email from me. It'll come from Bernie@Vengreso.com. And we have a resource here from MindTickle, which is an awesome podcast, Transforming Sales Enablement for Ongoing Sales Readiness. The Definitive Guide to Sales Enablement from Highspot, and then the Sales Leader's Guide to Converting Prospects to Sales Conversations from Vengreso. Again, that'll come to you in an email within 24 to 48 hours. The links will be ungated, no form to fill out, just click and open each one of them. And so on that note, I want to thank everyone for attending here today. And if you're watching in the future, thanks for sitting on a Saturday morning, sipping your coffee through this webinar, and hope that the 3-part framework we shared with you today has a great impact on your year in 2020 and beyond. See you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.